Hey, Michael with XForcePC. I want to talk to you about our titanium system. We've made some updates, so I kind of want to refresh the video here, going over it. And so I believe when we introduced the titanium, that's when the Skylake processors were out. It would be like the 6700K and the 6600K, or it would be the high-end chips. Well, now there's something, Intel's code name is Kaby Lake, and so that would be the i7 7700K and 7600K. And we run those at 4.6 and 4.4 gigahertz respectively. So those are the very fastest gaming processors. They're the fastest for running X-Plane or really any other game. They're quad core. There's very few games, very few that can take advantage of any more than a couple of cores. So 99% of games run faster on a quad core, and typically quad cores have higher clock speeds. You know, you go for a 6 core or an 8 core, it's going to run in the upper 3 gigahertz range. So you'd be better off quad core at 4.5 gigahertz than you are with 8 core at 3.5. Now, at the core of the system is the motherboard, and what we did with this is what we did with a lot of the components. Is we didn't go out there and find the cheapest motherboard we can find, and we also didn't go out there and find the most expensive one. We found really good components for the money, and that's why I believe the titanium is the best PC, best gaming system on the market, is because of that. We don't try to do, most companies that do what we do are at extremes. They're way at the cheap end. They're like, well, let's just get the lowest price we possibly can, and we'll get the business because, you know, our price is the lowest. And then there's the other extreme. Let's just go nuts with lighting and water and, you know, put it in a huge case with like a 1200 watt power supply, and, you know, we'll just outspec everybody. And then the people will say, well, you know, $5,000 for a computer, yeah, I know I'm getting something good because I'm spending $5,000 for it. Well, we don't find either one of those philosophies to be smart or the way to go. So what we do is we get the stuff that's the best. We're in the middle. And so we get the stuff that's really good for the money, that does a really good job. So what we have here for the motherboard is a Z270 chipset. It's the high-end enthusiast chipset for the Kaby Lake processors from Intel chipset. And just some things I'll point out. We got 4 memory slots, so if you get 16 gigs of RAM, we'll put in 2 8s. You'll have 2 more slots open, so if you want to add some RAM later, you can. We've got an M.2 slot here for an M.2 SSD. An M.2 SSD is about the size of a stick of gum and about the same thickness. And it just goes right here, and that's what you boot off of, and that's what your operating system is on, and all your programs. And so that makes the inside of the case very neat. You don't have to run any cables. It just goes right there, and you're done. And it's got direct access to the PCI Express bus. So it's a really neat technology, keeps the inside very uncluttered. Now, here on the back, some standard stuff and some extra good stuff. We've got a USB 3.0, which is the blue ports. We've got USB 3.1, which are the red ports, and those just have more bandwidth than USB 2.0. And we've got a gigabit Ethernet connection. We've got 7.1 sound, as well as stereo, if you just want to use the little green port. And as far as sound goes, what they've done here by this little imaginary, or not imaginary, actual line that they've drawn on the circuit board, is they're indicating that the sound is isolated to this section of the motherboard. And so it's isolated to prevent noise. So you get a cleaner sound. If you've got a real sensitive ear, you won't pick up a lot of noise, which you could get if the trace paths for the sound were passing very close to some of the, you know, communication for the memory or the graphics card. And so they've isolated it, they put it on a different layer of the board, and it's supposed to provide sound approaching the quality of a discrete or separate sound card. Now, one more thing I'll mention on the back, we have a USB Type-C connection. That's a little tiny thing, and you see it on phones a lot now, the newest phones coming out. I think the MacBooks use this as well. It's more of a mobile thing. It remains to be seen how it's going to be leveraged on the PC side, whether or not it'll fade into obscurity or it will be adopted and used heavily. So far, you know, it hasn't been used heavily, but you have it. It's nice to have, and that way if it becomes something that you want, you will have that already. So that's the motherboard, and now we're going to talk about some of the other items. Alright, let's talk about cooling. So these are CPU or processor coolers, and these fit right over the top of the processor, and let's talk about them a bit. This is an Intel retail cooler, and the gray material you see there is thermal paste, and this just sits right down on the processor, and then of course the fan spins to circulate air around, and so that basically the metal, the aluminum and the copper absorb the heat, and then the fan on top blows to disperse that heat from these metal fins. This is kind of the low end. This is where you start. This is suitable for Intel processors that have not been overclocked, that running standard clock speeds. And you know, it's a decent cooler, but it's a starting point. It's kind of the low end. Now, when you move up into something like this, like a tower cooler is what we call this. Now what you have is the processor goes against this part, excuse me, and this part goes right down on the processor, and of course you put a little thermal paste on there, and the heat gets transmitted up these copper heat pipes and winds up in these aluminum fins, and then the fan spins and blows through the fins and cools the processor. So this is one of the smaller tower coolers that you will find. So this is the next step up in cooling. But what we use on our titanium is a high-end tower cooler, and you see the difference there in the fan. You'll also see on the bottom there's more heat pipes here, and they also are more flush. Here it's kind of bumpy, it's hard to describe, but here it's a very smooth, level surface, which is what you want to make good contact with the processor. And you see, of course, it's a much beefier design. It's much heavier, there's much more metal involved. And what we found, so I'll go ahead and move this out of the way, what we found with the cooler that we're using on the titanium is this actually cools as well as water cooling, at least at the clock speeds we're running. So we're not going crazy with the overclocking. We're running the 7600K at 4.4, we're running the 7700K at 4.6. There are people getting 4.9, 5.0, and maybe in that case you might want water cooling, but those people are also flirting with lots of instability, or probably getting blue screens. And so with the overclocking we do, we have used water cooling and we've used this cooler, and we have found that this actually maintains the same temperature as a high-end water cooler like the Corsair H100i, which is a dual fan large water cooler. So we've been really impressed with this, and we've been using this cooler now for quite some time, and it's just been terrific. Hey, so just want to talk about some of the other components. I'm not going to get into showing you memory, but usually we run DDR4 2400 is a typical memory speed. If you look and do research, memory speed really doesn't make a whole lot of difference. So your biggest concern is stability. But because when you go up with memory speed, you also go up in latency. In other words, how fast the memory can respond. So it kind of cancels it out. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to go above around 2400, 2600 RAM, and that's where we usually stay. Graphics card wise, you know, there's not a whole lot of variability there. One GTX 1070, for the most part, is as good as another GTX 1070. We do like to look at the thermal situation with those and not go with cards that are too crazy overclocked, because they only have a small performance increase and they draw a whole lot more electricity and produce a whole lot more heat. Power supply wise, we're using a good quality 700 watt power supply. The typical power draw on the titanium, if you, let's say, had a 1080 in it, one of the higher end cards, and you're just maxing everything out, you probably couldn't get it to break 400 watts. So a 700 watt power supply at 80% efficiency certainly covers that. More typical power draw is going to be under 100 watts if you're just surfing the web, and around 200 watts if you're doing gaming, maybe 250, something like that, if you're simming or gaming. And then if you really manage to load things up, possibly, you get up close to 400, but that would be the max. Now we'll talk about the case as well. We don't go crazy with the case. There is a little bit of bling. You see the lighting in there, that just kind of comes with it. But we're using a case that's made by Corsair. It's a really nice case. They're known for doing or making really good components and hardware. And so, we've been using their cases off and on for quite some time, and have been very happy with everything that they've done. It's a full size, not a full tower, but it does accommodate a full size ATX case, full size ATX power supply, and it's what you refer to as a mid tower, again kind of in the middle. So it's not crazy huge and heavy and big, which might sound cool until you go and you have to move it somewhere and you realize, why did I buy such a humongous case? And you don't want it overly small because the thermal situation won't be as good. There's not as much area to dissipate heat. So, here in the front we've got two large fans, and then there's one in the back. There is a windowed side panel. Again, we're not big on bling around here, but sometimes, that kind of stuff just comes with the territory. Now the case probably looks really small right now because it's back behind me and I'm close to you. This is not a tiny case. This is a mid-tower case. You see our CPU cooler there, a few little lights, the graphics card there across the middle, and so that's what it looks like from the side. So that kind of sums up the titanium computer. We do think it's the best computer on the market. We think we have the best philosophy of going out, finding components that are really, really good for the money, that do a great job, but not be overly cheap or over expensive, and give you a really good, useful lifetime.